Mike Hatko. Please welcome Moonjeet Singh, Vice President and Immersive Computing Lead at Booz Allen Hamilton.
Good afternoon, everyone. You guys hear me okay? Audio good? Good. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about the current state of immersive technologies. We're also going to talk about where we think it's going to be going in the future. Today we really wanted to have kind of a focus and an emphasis on the enterprise use cases. And when we talk about enterprise, we're not just going to restrict it to public sector or private sector. We're going to explore, the whole spectrum when it comes to corporations who are looking for new ways to collaborate and engage with their geographic dispersed teams using these technologies, all the way to our warfighters who are demanding better training solutions and more immersive training solutions. So to accomplish that, I've got a very esteemed panel that is joining us really from across the country. Starting to my left here, we have Amber Osborne from Doghead Software. She is a Chief Marketing Officer. Doghead is doing some really impressive things with immersive technologies and some of their suites, and really looking forward to digging into that today. And Amber is also joining us from the #1 innovation hotbed in the country as far as AR/VR is concerned, out of Seattle, Washington. So thank you for making the trip over.
Yeah, thank you.
Next to Amber, we have Mr. Tony Cherry, who is recently retired, so make sure you congratulate him, or if you see him around the city later today, maybe buy him a drink. Tony, today, probably most what's on his mind is home improvement projects, vacations, and which golf course to hit next. As recently as 2 months ago, was the Director of Games and Simulations at the Arming Training and Doctorate Command, better known as TRADOC. And so Tony will be talking about some of the work that our warfighters are doing, the Army in particular, DoD, and how they're starting to adopt these technologies, what the potential looks like in that regard. And then last but certainly not least, we have Lucian Parsons. Lucian is joining us from the University of Maryland. For those of you who are not from the area, I think there's 2 things you need to know about UMD. Number 1, they are a top 10 computer science school nationwide and very well recognized in that regard. And then they also are one of the universities that's investing the heaviest in immersive technologies. Lucian actually leads up the Mixed Augmented Virtual Reality Innovation Center. If that's hard to remember, he's come up with a really awesome acronym called MAVERICK. So, and he has a really good conference coming up in the next few weeks, which we'll talk about as well. Thank you all for joining us today. So we wanted to talk about the current state of immersive and where we think it's going. And as I mentioned before, there is a lot of focus on how these technologies are starting to disrupt the consumer markets and just multiple verticals, whether it's the gaming industry, entertainment. In some cases we're seeing that disruption take place. In some cases we're seeing the industry really poised to take that on. We really wanted to talk about kind of the enterprise use cases as well, because we are seeing a hotbed of activity in that space right now. And frankly, I think it's something is often overlooked in the national media when it comes to the adoption of these technologies. But it's important, I think, to capture the state of it, just because, the last 6 months, we've seen some really amazing things take place, particularly in the headset space. We've seen the introduction of wireless headsets that have the capability to do tracking, all integrated inside the headset itself, wireless display capabilities. The reason I bring this up is, when we're talking about enterprise use cases, when it comes to our clients, whether they're in government or whether they're in industry, there are barriers of adoption that they've identified. Some big ones are like the form factor. It's too bulky, it's awkward. They don't like the cable that's being strung up to the computer to handle the GPU, streaming display. And so, so far we've seen Oculus/Facebook release the Oculus Go, which is really targeting kind of the low-end VR, low-end to mid-tier VR. And then they also released one kind of the opposite end of the spectrum called the Oculus Quest. Again, wireless display, what we call inside-out tracking, the ability to do spatial computing, identify where you are, where the controllers are, and what room you're in and where the physical, boundaries and objects are that the headset and you need to be aware of as you're going through these experiences. And the Oculus Quest has got the capability to do arena-scale tracking now, which is really exciting. So we're starting to see a lot of these, identified barriers of adoption start to break down.
We also saw HTC release the Vive Pro. That was about 6 months ago. And this is really an ultra high-end, headset, really targeted at the enterprise. It's got a price tag commensurate with their, I think, addressable market. But the display is really fantastic, integrated audio, not quite wireless tracking yet, but I think that we're expecting some big things out of HTC in the future as well. And then one of the most exciting things for me, and it's admittedly kind of a boring topic, is Microsoft with their HoloLens 2 has announced that it's going to have some of the enterprise features that we need inside the enterprise baked into it. Things like security controls, mobile device management, identification, identity and authentication management, stuff like that. One of the biggest announcements, though, is that it'll have an onboard neural network accelerator. And what that means is that the HoloLens will be able to accomplish some basic AI capabilities to enrich the experience and really help with things like object identification and some of the onboard functionality that it has. And so we are going to be talking today about the intersect of artificial intelligence and immersive and what that means for the enterprise, because we are starting to see the industry really poise for that convergence. And then, of course, it would be remiss if we didn't mention Magic Leap, who released their headset. I think all of us have received one or are about to receive one. Reviews are coming in, kind of mixed, but I think there's a lot of promise there, especially for some of the enterprise use cases that we've been talking about. So I'm actually going to start with Lucian. We talked about just what we've seen in the last 6 months. That was a lot, and it is a very dizzying and at times overwhelming space for those of us who are watching it pretty closely. Can you give us kind of a brief history of time of how we arrived at this point, and really what has kind of led us on this path on the immersive?
Sure. So that was a great technical synopsis of where we are and at this current moment. I think it's important to step back a little bit when we're talking about what does it actually mean? What does this technology give us? And we're currently in kind of the third wave of, hey, VR is the future. The first wave, late 80s, early 90s. Second one, late 90s. Arguably, you could go back to the 70s for the first one if you wanted to. But what happened in the early 90s is we had this idea, oh, hey, it's a 3D world, and we're doing everything on these flat screens. That doesn't make sense. We finally have the technology to take it off of a flat screen. But everything we did back at that point was custom-built. Custom-built hardware, custom-built software. Nobody actually had been programming in 3D, really. And so when we tried to build something in that environment, we were talking about $200 million projects. Well, if you've got a $200 million project, you need at least a $300 million problem in order to get any sort of ROI. So what did we get? We got flight simulators for the Navy and the Air Force and the Army, et cetera. Because if you crash a plane and you kill a bunch of people, that's a several $100 million problem, especially if you start crashing more than one. And then the next wave, about 10 years ago, the costs started dropping rapidly. And the costs dropped because the technology was better, but there was still no standard platform, and there was still no standard hardware. And so then we're looking at a $20 million kind of effort to get something meaningful in VR. And we're now at the point where we've dropped another order of magnitude. And for just a couple of $1 million, and I say that, just a couple of million, you can create something meaningful. And the path we're on, though, now that we have a couple of kind of standardized hardware platforms, we have some standardized software, and we've also got a whole generation of programmers and creators who've been doing this for the last 20 years, mostly in video games, but also in simulation and training. And so that's just going to keep going down, and soon we're going to be in the sub-$1 million range. And at a sub-$1 million, that opens up an enormous range of possibilities for what you can create effectively and with positive ROI compared to what we had before. And it also opens up the playing field, because when you needed a $100 million lab, or you had to be in Silicon Valley or Seattle, no offense, in order to make these things happen, then that limited the pool naturally. And You mentioned the Maverick conference in 2 weeks. We've got 40 local companies, including our host, Booz Allen, showing off some of their stuff that's going to happen, that's being built here in this region. And so now, with the government, with some of the corporations, people can be building this where the people using it are. And that's going to make an enormous difference as well. So I see a huge opening up of possibilities because of these trends.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think a couple of themes there, right? There's been kind of this drastic cost reduction that we've seen, and higher ROI. I mean, some of these headsets that we're dealing with now were like $50,000 just 6 or 7 years ago. So, Tony, one of the questions I had for you, I mean, Lucian hit on kind of the decreasing costs. He also hit on some of the complex simulators that the military has used in the past, and leveling out the playing field. In the spirit of that, it seems like these commoditized technologies are opening up new opportunities in the military space. Can you chat about what your personal thoughts are on the applicability of these technologies for the purposes of training and simulation in the DoD?
Sure, and I would say that DoD, Department of Defense, is probably one of the most fertile environments for this that exists any place in the world. Historically, back to 1922, our first simulator was made by a guy by the name of Link, Mr. Link, and his company came from organs, and they knew bellows, and they knew how to make things move, and he put that into an airplane trainer. And then came World War II. At the end of World War II, the Royal Air Force Chief of Staff said, quote, "The Luftwaffe met its Waterloo on the training fields of the free world where there were batteries of Link trainers." So that's our history as far as immersive or virtual, whatever. You go today, and we talked about crashing airplanes. The simulators, they make you sweat. You are afraid of making a mistake because you're going to crash your airplane, but you're virtual. You don't want to get shot at because it could kill you if you're in squad combat, or you can be underwater in special operations. And some of the things they do scare me sometimes with the fidelity, or gunships where a U.S. AC-130 crew can be virtually linked with an Australian group and bring fire on enemy in Afghanistan. All virtually, all heads. It's great. The Navy, their CIC, it goes on and on. Incredibly fertile due to the nature of the business. We can crash airplanes all day long. We can be killed all day long. We can not get our regulator. We can sink our ship. That's one of the beautiful things about AR and VR and DoD.
Awesome. I think we're starting to see a lot of headway in that space as well. What's interesting is that education using these technologies kind of takes on different capabilities and manifests itself in different ways. Amber, you guys are exploring kind of a different use case, more focused on collaboration and higher education using your software. Can you kind of chat about that space and some of your capabilities?
I would love to. Our software, Rumi VR, we have essentially a meeting space. So you can have a meeting space in virtual reality. You can even have your meeting rooms, your lobbies customized for, say, even like this tent. We could have this conference in virtual reality. So there's so many different opportunities in education, especially a higher education, and we use a lot of 3D models. So that way that you can visualize having an airplane right in front of you. You can pull off expensive parts that if you made it in a real model, it would be extremely time-consuming and extremely expensive, where then you can go and collaborate. I really believe that instead of video conferencing, that this is going to be the future of how we communicate and how we work. Also because when you're in virtual reality, you're not seeing what's behind you on the video screen. So if you have sensitive information, say papers on a desk or anything on a whiteboard, you're not going to be able to see that in VR, where video conferencing, you do have that risk.
So it's kind of an interesting anecdote. Admittedly, I was a little skeptical when I heard about Doghead and Rumi, but just last week we held our first all hands all in VR. And we had about 30 people from the team all inside this virtual space. We did celebrated the anniversaries, big awards. We even imported a 3D model of some VR work that we're doing for one of our clients. And everybody was able to kind of walk around the 3D model, look at it from different angles, offer critiques and suggestions on improvements, ask questions. We could animate the 3D model. Very, very powerful. So I definitely
Did you
agree.
get to high five? That's
Yes,
my
we did.
favorite part. Okay, that's
Yep,
awesome.
high fives and all the emojis built in.
Yeah.
Customized my little avatar. It
Awesome.
was fantastic.
Perfect.
All right, good. So you guys have kind of a sense now at how each one of our panelists approach this industry. I think we wanted to get into some of the exciting topics that are happening now or that are starting to unfold. And one of them is the one I mentioned earlier around the convergence of artificial intelligence and immersive. And I think there's a lot of confusion when we're talking about this topic, and mostly because both technologies, they're at right around the peak of the quote, Gartner hype cycle, and so there's a lot of information out there, some good information, some misinformation. I think for the purposes of this topic, we'll just talk about artificial intelligence as the ability for a machine or an algorithm to infer information based off data that it's provided the same way that a human might without necessarily having a human in the loop or without having the need to have a human in the loop. And really one of the tools that I think we are excited about in this space is machine learning and deep learning. And that is one of the tool sets that we use to write these algorithms, to train them, and to help inform them. And so, like Lucian, when we're starting to talk about this area of AI and immersive, coming together, kind of curious what your thoughts are there. Are you starting to see the design patterns that you expected to see? Are you starting to see that there's some promise there? What's your kind of...
Well, I think one of the really interesting things about being in this space right now is although we have a nice background and kind of capability set built, there's still not a standard user interface. There's not a way that we know we're going to use it yet. And there's not a way to use it yet. And so that's tough. It makes it hard to do some things, but it also kind of opens up the possibility space. And I think the AI piece of it is going to be really important because it turns out that saying everything you want to say is kind of hard. If you've tried to order something using only your voice, and there's like 15 different sizes, and there's 3 different brands, and there's 5 different levels, and you have to spend a lot of time. And I think as we integrate AI into this augmented world that we're living in, and I'm including natural language processing as an augmented technology. It doesn't have to be visual, although visual will be really important. It's going to start taking it from a demand-driven thing of, oh, I need to know this thing, or I need to go do this thing. Let me pull out my supercomputer in my pocket or purse and go ask for it. To, oh, well, I'm in this situation. The camera on my glasses or wherever it is recognizes the situation, or maybe it's based off of location, and it starts proactively pushing information to me. And so this offboarding of the human memory that started with the smartphone, well, arguably earlier, but it has really accelerated, has an opportunity to take another step. And as we get a better user interface, if we understand how people need this information, and we can use AI to kind of deliver that information in the moment, we're going to have a phenomenal increase in human productivity. Because personally, I am very interested in the human in the loop part of this. The AI on its own, the machine learning on its own, some really interesting things out there, but it's how can we augment the capabilities of people and really create superhuman capabilities that are where the near-term future certainly is, and where I also think we should be spending a lot of time. That's certainly what we're spending time on at Maverick.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Air Force actually has a really great example of just that right now. They're currently working in partnership with HTC Vive on figuring out how they can train pilots and do it in a safer way, a more efficient way, and a less expensive way. So they're using AI in virtual reality environments to monitor heart rate. So if the heart rate is faster, then they know then to program for a different kind of training module, as well as it will change the environments judging on different reactions that the human has. I'm not sure if they're using any kind of haptics for that, but I think it's just eye monitoring and tracking in the headsets, as well as heart rate monitoring. So there's a lot of AI being built into military-focused software and also training software. But currently, on a consumer level, there are workout and fitness programs that you can get through VR that have that kind of more simple AI technology in it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you hit on, another big trend that we're starting to see, and that's the ability to, have instrumentation built into the headsets and collect data about the user. And, when I say data about the user, it's really like, where is the user looking? If you take about a military training application, are they looking downrange? Are they looking at their short-range targets? Eye tracking, things like that, really to gauge the efficacy of training and how effective the simulation is. Tony, this is an area that the US military has been looking at for a number of years. When you start to talk about these data streams, either natively from the headset or augmented with sensors, the way Amber was describing, what kind of possibilities does that open up when you start to inject these new tech into it?
Yeah, I really had probably the best job in the whole Army. One of my branches was gaming and simulation, and another one of my branches was data science and AI. It was kind of a different directorate, so I got a chance to think through or try and meld the two of them. So I am beside myself with where we're at right now and the potential for where we're going. You've heard it here at the conference, by the way, depending on what sessions that you've been in. So Susan Kellwhite from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency the other day said something in session here that we've been trying to push. She said the data ought to come find the person with the need. You said, dial up what you need. What she's saying, what I believe, is the data comes find you. Why not? And then the lady from Intel this morning, Ada, I forget her last name, she was talking about 5G. Okay, now's the time. It's going to happen. You can start to see it. So again, back on history. This is the 25th year from Mogadishu, Black Hawk down, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine if those pilots had had the kind of immersive or heads-up or AI-driven displays, what could have happened? As we take a look back, everything that they experienced, all the things that they were responding to could have been captured with either sensors and fed back into an algorithm that gave them a different answer, a different altitude and how to maneuver. We're starting to see that now in, for example, the Army's Squad Soldier Virtual Trainer SSVT, where they're physically saying that we want to get some of that AI stuff and we want to put it into the VR stuff and it'll be good.
Yeah.
These are generals talking. That's the way they talk. They've got some really good engineers that are making it happen. One final thing that's got me all excited right now is General Mattis, the DepSecDef. He is not a technologist. God love him. He does a lot of things good. He's not a technologist. But he knows that this training and this AI is here now. And he has put a mandate out that is driving a lot of what's happening. His goal is to fight 25 bloodless battles before you do it for real. And that's the way DoD is starting to move. So it's very exciting intersection of technologies because we have to go faster, and AI and data science is going to help the VR and AR guys get there.
It's interesting because, in previous technologies that we've seen emerging, the U.S. military and DoD have always been a few clicks back, right? They've waited for those technologies to mature and kind of harden in the enterprise space and the consumer space. and then they've adopted them. But with Immersive, we're actually seeing the DoD be one of the fastest adopters of these technologies, probably only right behind the consumer space. So it is fascinating. So with that, let's
much more effectively
yes
than the consumer space.
I would agree. Yep. So let's explore kind of the future a little bit. I'm curious for each one of you. We have a vast realm of possibilities in front of us when it comes to AR, VR, and at some point XR and mixed. I'm curious when we talk about kind of the future-looking, possibilities, either opportunities of where this technology could go, peripherals that could be added, or what types of challenges you guys are concerned about. I'm just kind of curious what's top of mind. And Amber, if it's okay, we'll start with you.
Awesome. So has anybody seen Ready Player One, the movie? So you remember when he puts on the suit? That's essentially, it's called a haptic suit. So you can feel. That was set, I believe, in 2025 or so. We already pretty much have that technology now. There's a company that's called Haptics, like HaptX, that just yesterday announced their haptics gloves, which I got to try out, and I got to tell you, it is an experience because even working in VR and working with so much technology, you have those wow moments, and that was definitely a wow moment. So you put on these haptic gloves, and inside the gloves, they have pressure sensors. And he explains it beautifully, so you can ask him later. But they have pressure sensors, so when you're in a VR headset, you can go and grab a cloud, and you can feel the cloud. You can squish the cloud. You can feel the weight of the cloud. And you can feel temperature. So they have a demonstration of an ice cube, and you can feel temperature as well as fire. And where this comes in handy, especially with any kind of military use cases, is I believe there's firefighters right now that are training on it, and they can test for temperature. You go and grab a door handle, they can feel that heat in the door handle. So there's a lot of just amazing haptic technologies that are coming out that I believe, the future is now with that kind of technology.
Yep.
Of course, it is very expensive. Haptics yesterday, if you're a developer, they released dev kits, so if you want to try it out, go ask them. But I think the biggest barrier to entry is the expense right now of the products. And on a consumer level, I just tell everybody, get out and go try VR if you haven't. There's plenty of VR arcades. There's one in DC right down the road that they have Mario Kart VR, which awesome. And yeah, go out and experience it and try it. It's probably not going to make you nauseous. There's a lot of I don't know about VR, but go and try it, because I was one of those people myself, and then I fell in love with the use cases and how it could be used in enterprise, and also how we're going to be using it with communication and training in the future.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think, just like we talked about how some of the headsets were like $50,000 a few years ago, and now you can go all in for, if you're in the Oculus Go, for $200 or $300.
200, yeah.
High end, maybe $2K. And so we do expect those prices to drop pretty significantly. But yeah, they're one of the first entrants. I think the haptic space is very exciting. Yeah. Tony, how about you?
So I'm going to describe a little bit of a future view that I'm not sure has been written about real well, but you want to know the future. So I've described the world of the kinetic today, and we do that pretty well. I'm very proud of where DoD is at, but more and more I think that we're going to get into the non-kinetic aspects of conflict of wills, call it war if you will, and higher echelons, so that I would see our leaders in the future at the division commander level. And it's funny we were talking about haptics, because I think haptics are going to be part of this, where they have a haptic suit that they wear as part of their daily uniform, where they can get sensations on different aspects of the battlefield, whether it's, hey, the economics in this potential sector is going to a pot because we just destroyed the gas line, something like that. That can be done, I think, with data science, the things that we've heard discussed here in this conference, AI, and where we're going. So that is an expansion of the capabilities, but I also think that we're going to get higher fidelity, so that modeling this room would probably take a really good guy to do it at high fidelity a week. Sorry, that's really the answer. But with algorithms and data, maybe it could be done in a couple milliseconds. That would dramatically change things, and I think that we're there. Finally, one thing that is not unique to DoD, but it's a little bit different, and it's security. Everything that we do has got to have some kind of security behind it. The threat doesn't want to take my money. He doesn't want to influence my vote. He wants to kill me. So we tend to try to protect that, but try to run AR and VR distributed through an encryption device. It's painful. It doesn't work very well. We're starting to see now some things that are happening in the security field that will allow better distribution and better security simultaneously.
That's huge, yeah, especially in the DoD space.
Yeah.
For sure.
So Maverick was founded with kind of 3 goals. One is to increase the diversity of participants in the area, working in AR and VR, to work on particularly simulation and training, and the future of media, in thinking about how these technologies are being used and promoting them. Because we're actually a Department of Commerce funded thing, so our job is to create jobs, not through the university. And what's interesting is, as I look at, there's this huge space in simulation and training. There's this huge space in operations. It's both military and enterprise. And I think the enterprise is right at the cusp of being ready to kind of take off. One is the drop in costs. One is the availability of people who are capable of creating these things. And actually, there's already a program that I can run on my laptop where I can take photographs of this entire room and run it through, and it will automatically create the 3D model for that, and it does it in seconds. It's not good enough for the kinetic yet, but it's good enough for most other uses. But what we've discovered in the 1 year that we've been operating is that, there's a whole lot we don't know yet. And so if you look at the predictions for how big VR will be, and a couple of years ago in the hype cycle, we were like, consumer VR is going to be $100 billion in 2 years now. Nobody believed that. No, except for some VCs who apparently bought into it. Like there was no way that anybody was actually building the stuff, believed it. But what it is ready for at this point is for people to bring it into their businesses and to bring it into their agencies. And so we try to help people understand what the next 5 years looks like, and then what does it look like past that. And the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of augmented things. We're going to see, we have a HoloLens thing that we're doing with the University of Maryland, Baltimore, where we take your sonogram information and overlay it via HoloLens on the doctor's view. So now the doctor isn't doing this to see what's going on inside of you. They're looking at the leg or whatever, and they can see inside of it while they're looking at you. That means the doctor's not disengaged from the patient. That's potentially enormous. So we're going to see a lot of it. But then the most exciting thing is if you look past the next couple of years and look at those predictions, there's about 66% of that $150 billion that we think it's going to be that says other. Other means we have no idea what it's going to be. And the reason we have no idea is because in VR, we are at the same place we were at in 2008 with these. Hey, that's really cool. I can get my email on the phone and do something. I don't know what else it's good for. Yeah. And we're kind of right there with VR right now. We don't know what else it's good for yet, but we have a huge number of people who are going to create that. And a lot of them are here. Yeah. And so that's really exciting.
Yeah, and we still pay $900 for a phone. Yeah. So VR headsets, it's $200. It's getting there. So
it's getting there. Yeah. I think that's a really, really interesting point. The other is certainly exciting, and the price point. Something we didn't mention earlier is a lot of these phones now are having really impressive AR capabilities built into them.
Yeah,
We saw that.
they're already in there.
Yeah,
There's 100 million AR capable phones
Yeah.
on the planet already.
Yep.
We don't, but other than Pokemon Go, nobody knows what to do with it yet, right?
Yep.
And Pokemon Go isn't really AR, but that's a different thing.
Yeah.
All right, so I have run out of questions, so I'm going to key it over to the audience here. We've got some wandering mics running around. If you guys have any questions, please raise your hand.
Sure. Paul Sizemore. I just moved to DC, and something that I'm really interested in is using AR and supplementing it with AI. So the question I have for you is, you mentioned when technologies get sub-$1 million level, they become viable. And so when are we as developers going to get hardware, in your opinion, where it will dynamically be able to create a 3D model of our environment, sub-$1 million level? Or and do it really well and do it quickly.
So
I mean, I know there's a few things out
Yeah.
on the market, but they're, I don't know.
they're still like quite pricey. There's amazing 3D cameras that you can get as well to create environments, 3D environments. But I mean, as a developer, I would go and do a little bit of research and see who out there is already doing, because I don't have any current examples, but we work with some companies that provide us with that type of content. So companies are doing it. They already have models. But I mean, my best answer is just get on the internet and see who's already doing it. There's a lot of really great resources for, I think it's Telegram. It's a big long word. It's escaping me right now. But yeah, there are 3D model environment softwares out there that are a little bit on the lower end. So.
Just a couple more things too. We mentioned the HoloLens is going to have kind of that onboard neural network accelerator. Microsoft is, I think, actively taking applications right now for developers that want a beta version of that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not supposed to ship until like the first half of next year, but I think the beta versions will ship, and you might be able to get your hands on that if you can put a convincing case.
So reach out to the hardware companies. They're giving dev kits all the time. I believe it's a little bit outside the time to get them magically, but again, just go ahead, contact them, let them know what you're going to want to produce and what kind of content you want to produce. Magic Leap especially is very supportive of content creators. So, yeah.
I actually have a quick question about the ethics of VR as things become more and more realistic. I think it's really interesting that Mattis says that he wants to be able to fight 25 battles before they actually step out on the battlefield. But at what point, when that technology moves over to the civilian side for video games and that sort of thing, do we enter like a moral gray space? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Didn't hear your last sentence.
So like when Mattis talks about he wants to
right.
do 25 battles before he steps onto the battlefield with troops, at what point when that technology migrates over to the civilian space, video games, other applications, does that become like a moral gray area, and what your thoughts are?
Yeah, so good question. I am a parent, and I think that there's an awful lot of that kind of thing that has to take place to keep the technology separate. I don't think that it will ever be scientifically possible to stop them from migrating, but I really don't want criminals able to rob the bank 25 times before they go do it for real. I have to admit, I've never been asked that question before, and that was a good one. I currently don't know how to stop the technology from getting misused. But I can't. So I see that as a danger, but from my perspective, DoD, the worth is more significant than the danger. Good question.
That's a very good question.
We actually do talk about that a lot, and actually the keynote is somebody, the former director from Magic Leap, a former director from Magic Leap who's specifically going to talk about ethics. But it is, it's important to remember it's an enabling technology, and like any technology, there's going to be good uses and bad uses. I think what's really important right now, where we are, is that we start getting ahead of that and start thinking about it. There's a lot of really interesting legal questions even about who owns things, especially with AR. So if I walk in here and I write something in AR on the wall, could the Atlantic or Booz Allen say, no, you have to take that down because this is our space and we own it, right? Or what happens if that's on the sidewalk? And so there's some really interesting ethical and legal questions that need to be answered and need to be considered right now, even before we get to the specific use cases. And I absolutely encourage that discussion and want to make sure that we are talking about it from both a policy standpoint and from a technical standpoint of what do we want to enable.
I think we can learn something too from some of the recent technology trends. Like in the AI space, we did see some instances where unconscious bias was being coded into algorithms, and trained along those lines. And so I think it's very important that we harness our lessons learned, everything that we've learned, over the past few years, and incorporate that in a way that can be measured and controlled to a certain extent. So, other questions?
A variation on the theme and picking up on a comment you just made. Are there any examples of civilian use, particularly law enforcement use of the training, 25 bloodless battles, when you're thinking about unarmed shootings, but also with regard to police officers or law enforcement first responders who might have a bias against a certain cohort in the community? Is there a way to use biometrics and use AI to determine, one, whether or not there is such bias, and two, either can be trained out, and three, maybe they shouldn't be in that community if it can't be trained out?
So I actually have a specific case for this. So at UMD, we are working with one of the local police departments built a 3D environment, produced the same content, same situation, same script with multiple races being the protagonist, and we're working with the police department. They're putting all of their officers through this training to expose unconscious bias, right? And so when you're presented with the same situation in a randomized trial basis with different protagonists, how does the officer react? And we're tracking pupil dilation and eye tracking. We could do respiration and heart rate. I'm not sure if that's included in it, but they are absolutely doing that. And we're not the only group that's working on that. The Anti-Defamation League is working with a number of people around the world for that as well. And then we're also doing things with firefighters for training. As you mentioned earlier, there's quite a few groups working with that as well.
We did a collaborative project with the Customs and Border Protection folks. They have a facility in West Virginia that they use for training, and they are very much doing the kind of things that you talked about here. That's my experience in the area. I want to ask a question.
Sure.
If you're all the way in the sound of my voice, if you're a Rabid VR headset user, raise your hand. Okay, if you have used them and you kind of like them and maybe you have one, raise your hand.
Sure.
If you've put them on a couple times, but you're not quite there yet, hands. And if you're here just to learn something and you've never even put on a headset before, raise your hands. Yeah, that's a really good mix. And that's you mentioned it, and that's what we're experiencing. But I got to tell you that I got more in the middle than I thought we were going to get there.
Yeah.
Well, and so that actually makes you a really unusual audience, because I speak to audiences of like Rotary clubs and business groups a lot, and about 80% of them have heard of VR but don't really know what it stands for, even much less have tried it themselves. We tend to live in our own little bubbles and think that everybody knows what we know. And so if we know it, we think everybody else does. But we're still right there at the beginning of this technology.
Yes. What's the future of the use of robotics to replace the battlefield soldiers, as well as the use of automatically and remotely controlled heavy vehicles like tanks?
So just because of the nature of my last job, I actually have an answer for you that it's a studied answer. Robotics are coming more and more. Their utility is growing. Pack animals, medics, whatever. Their lethality is growing. Drones, ground pounders, whatever. The DoD standard right now is that there will never be a lethal engagement of a robot without a human in the loop. Today, that's the standard. There is a growing list of people, though, and a growing number of folks that are challenging that, saying that given that a robot can potentially, or a smart weapon can potentially limit collateral damage and can execute quicker than a human and therefore prevent damage, is it immoral, and that's the word being used, is it immoral not to allow certain robots to execute on their own? That's not policy. Policy is there will always be a human, but it's being discussed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Daniela Kamrath is my name. Could you make a classifications of the industries that benefit the most of where we are right now with VR and AR? And also, Lucian, could you tell us how we find out more about your conference?
Thanks. Sure. So I'll start with that.
Did you pay her?
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'll give you the 20 later. So the conference is in 2 weeks. It's October 17th and 18th at UMD. Maverick.umd.edu. We'll give you more information. Would love to have everybody there to learn more. It'll be 2 days of talking about topics like this, including ethics, and the technology and the enterprise use cases. I'll defer the question about where the best uses are, although I certainly can opine.
So our customers over at Doghead Simulations is anywhere from enterprise, from large enterprise to mostly education. So education and training, what I mean by that is companies and education facilities will use our product beyond just meeting spaces. They have created entire classrooms and auditoriums to have their classes. We work with Full Sail University in Orlando, Florida, and they're currently teaching their game design classes inside of our software with anywhere from 10 to 30 students at a time and an instructor. And they've been running this program for I think like the last 4 or 5 months with great feedback. And we're definitely learning a lot from the students and how that they're interacting. But so far, it's been extremely positive feedback. I think one of the things with any kind of industry getting into VR is that the technology that they're using, the headsets, the laptops, most of them don't even know that they already have those resources. For example, with colleges and education facilities, a lot of them already have technology partners with computer companies, and they don't realize that they can also get VR headsets through those companies. So if you're in any kind of industry and you're a little bit interested in VR, look at those partnerships that you already currently have if you want to start being that evangelist and pushing it in your industries.
Well, the mic's passing over. I just wanted to raise one point and kind of foot stomp a point that Lucian made. You know, UMD is kind of taking a lead right now at saying, let's organize the DC, Northern Virginia, Maryland communities that are focused on AR, VR, you know, start to talk more. As much as we love going to Seattle and Austin and some of the other hotbeds, you know, we've got a lot of work that's happening in this area. And so I would really encourage you to take a look at Maverick and let's start getting organized, you know, around our area here and start sharing lessons learned. Because I think a lot of us are going to be working on the same problems.
So in other talks in this conference, the conversation has inevitably led to cybersecurity and how do we make different technology resilient. And it just occurred to me that I've never heard anyone discuss making AR, VR resilient. But if these tools are being used to train, especially our first responders, our warfighters, then we really don't want someone getting in there and reprogramming things to increase bias rather than decrease it. So have you come across in your work anything to make sure that the VR, AR systems can't be hacked either?
So good question. There's a couple things there. One, resiliency can also be hardware, software, durability. And I just want to say up front that I'm hearing a very healthy discussion in at least DoD saying we don't want to build these things so that they're invincible. We can't afford it. We need lightweight devices, lightweight things, so if I break it, I can't get my phone out. I just throw it away. I can get another. But that's not necessarily what you're talking about. I don't know of any. But that was a good question. The things that can be done with AI and data science right now would lead me to believe it's possible, but I am not aware of any in DoD.
So we've had a number of discussions about this.
Yeah, there's, resiliency can kind of manifest itself in different ways. One of the interesting spaces we're looking at, we talked about the convergence of AI and immersive coming together. Another theme that's happening right now is a convergence of kind of these cloud architecture, modern software development, and immersive coming together. And so, the reason I bring that up is you look at a project that Google released recently called Agonez. It's in partnership with Ubisoft. And it's really built off their Kubernetes platform, which powers the most intense workloads in the world. Theirs included. A lot of the big, .coms use that clustering mechanism for scheduling. I think that is really critical because I think we would all acknowledge that immersive is not going to get anywhere without back-end cloud support, streaming data and, providing that capability. So I think those projects are really interesting. Microsoft also just started a cloud gaming division where they took some of their best people from Xbox and some of their best people from their Azure cloud computing practice and have created this division. And so I think in terms of the resiliency of kind of the back end and the software, I think we're starting to see some progress there as well. I don't know if that's what you had in mind. Or...
Yeah, so a lot of the tools that are being used, like the game development tools for the artificial environment, were not designed that way. And so I've been talking with NASA, for example, and they're like, we can't use it because we can't install it because it requires these ports to be open and we can't put it on our secure networks. And Johns Hopkins Advanced Physics Laboratory had the same problem. They had to create a new subnet for their VR space so that they couldn't, because it couldn't be commingled with any of the secure areas. So it is being looked at from that perspective, and it's also being looked at from an ethical standpoint of if we get to the point where I am able to see things in the real world that aren't there, at some point those are going to be so real that I have a hard time distinguishing between them. We already see people in the videos who are playing pool or looking at an engine, and they're wearing VR glasses, and they forget that there's not actually a table there, and so they fall on their face. And so people have already started thinking about, well, how do we make sure that people kind of know that distinction between the real and the not? And it's a design problem right now, but it's also going to be a technical problem.
One thing, and by the way, one of the problems of setting up here is that we hear things for the first time and we often don't have time to cogitate it, but this is one that I think I did. One thing that is happening that I'm pretty excited about from a resiliency perspective and gets to your point about people mucking with the software is that more and more DoD is understanding open source software is the way to go, and open source software is much more resilient than an EXE. For example, I didn't pay for software in the last 5 years I was in civil service. Just didn't do it. And my stuff worked much better and we came much faster than anything I'd ever done with the big companies. So that's not intentionally being done to address what you were talking about, but it is happening.
Okay. We have time for one more? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thinking back recently to Mark Zuckerberg's testimony to a panel of U.S. Senate innovators, which kind of became fodder for late-night comedians. touching on the really crucial issues of ethics, laws, liability, which you were just addressing. What's being done now, or what could be done to better engage by other branches of government, academia, industry, better engage, better educate, or start the process of better educating the legislative branch of government? Because at some point, they are going to have to get involved to, litigate on these issues of liability, ethics, laws. And if we wait too long and then we try to go back and get them to catch up, they're having a hard time with the technology of Facebook, and that's pretty simple stuff compared to what we're talking. So how are you? How can we reach out? I don't mean this to be belittling. They're an incredibly important part of our life, but how do we keep them up to speed?
I'll go ahead and then you can. I think as a industry, and I'm talking about the VR industry and the AR, XR, whatever, industry as a whole, we have a bit of a responsibility as pioneers in creating these new technologies to start working with the companies that have policies in place. I remember when social media first came out, it was like every company that I was working with I was like, do you have a social media policy? And they're like, what is that? Things weren't put into place. Those regulations weren't put into place yet. So right now, as we're producing these technologies, I think it's up to us as the creators and also on the end of the users to start that process and making those, and those regulations and security and ethics as well. So we still have a little bit of work to do with that, definitely, because there's, again, like that was a great point that you brought up about, where are the loopholes, and these are things that maybe we haven't thought about yet. So progressing it to a higher level to government would be fantastic. But again, I saw the Facebook trial, and even trying to explain Facebook was a little difficult.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine trying to explain why a haptic suit did this or that, or why an AR or VR, why something happened. So I believe that we have a bit of a responsibility as an industry to start creating those regulations and passing it up and educate, like get more people in VR headsets and get them introduced to what the technology actually is.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I don't know if you guys know of anything in the region. I know that there has been some interest at the congressional level around this, and I know that Facebook has stood up a team here of public policy experts who are also versed in immersive technologies to try to start that narrative and start that discussion. I think that that's probably an area that we just have to monitor and as practitioners, take it seriously and be advocates of it.
Yeah, really important to what I used to do, I guess, but I'm going to go back to something that you heard here on the stage yesterday with Susan Kelwhite from NGA. I was thrilled to hear her say that. She said that they are writing tradecraft into the algorithms that the intelligence community is using, just right. So what we need to do on everything from basic simulations to AR to VR to data science is to ensure that our algorithms reflect our national ethics and our national morality. We can't allow it merely to be a 0 and 1 most efficient. No, it has to reflect our morality. And I think there's a lot of safety there, even if policymakers don't quite understand something. If they are assured and open source software can demonstrate that morality is being built into the code from the beginning, that's what separates us from our competitors, and I just think it's valuable.
Cool. All right, well, I think we are at time, so what we'll do is we'll hang out here by the stage for a while if you guys have any other questions. Just a few things. I mean, obviously, these are industry luminaries. They are deep in the technology and, are certainly thought leaders. So follow them on social media. You can find their information in the app.
We also have a few VR demos in the back. So if you are steeped in VR and you play Beat Saber and Skyrim and all that fun stuff, and you want to see what we're doing for some of our military clients, it's pretty cool. I would go take a look at it because it certainly opens up some realms of possibility. With that, I just want to thank all you guys for coming, especially at your lunch hour, and hope you enjoyed the festival. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you.